Matthew 7, verses 11 to 14. If you then, who are evil, know how to give good gifts to your children, how much more will your Father, who is in heaven, give good things to those who ask him? So whatever you wish that others would do to you, do also to them, for this is the law and the prophets. Enter by the narrow gate, for the gate is wide and the way is easy that leads to destruction, and those who enter by it are many. For the gate is narrow and the way is hard that leads to life, and those who find it are few.
Well, Jesus is going to talk to us about choices today. And it said that we make our choices, and then our choices make us. Our life is really the end result of choices that we make. We make our choices, and our choices determine the direction of our life, and then the direction of our life determines our destination. Now, we know that's true in kind of physical locations and destinies. If you want to go to Niagara Falls, so you want to go to Niagara Falls, have a good time, see the falls, maybe take in a show, do something, but you said, I don't like the QEW. I don't like that road. Right? It's got that tall bridge, kind of bit windy sometimes. I just don't like that road. You know what I really like? I like the 400. I love that road. It takes me kind of through a wide road. It's kind of got some nice countryside, all those garden farms along the side. I like where it takes me. I can see some nice colored leaves. I'm going to take the 400. No matter how you drive or no matter what your intention, you're not going to get to Niagara Falls. But I intend to get to Niagara Falls. I'm sincere about Niagara Falls. No, you're not going to get to Niagara Falls. Our direction determines our destination. Now, we laugh at that because it's true when we're driving. It's also true in a lot of other areas of our life. If we said, I want to have a good retirement, I want a nice nest egg when I retire, but you said, you know what, I don't like putting money in the bank. I don't like having to say no to buying some things. I want to be able to spend my money as I want. I'm going to choose to spend money. You will never have a retirement nest egg. Oh, but I'm sincere. I intend. I want to have a retirement. You won't have it. Our choices determine our direction, and our direction determines our destination. Or you might say, I want to really live a healthy lifestyle. I want to be really healthy, but I don't like exercising. I want to eat at the Mandarin buffet 7 nights a week. You're not going to have a healthy lifestyle. No shade on Mandarin, but you're probably not. Our direction determines our destination. This is why sometimes, you see, when someone's life just collapses, and sometimes people's lives collapse because of outside forces or things that are done to them or what other people do. Sometimes they collapse because of the decisions they make. And you look at someone's life that collapses and you talk to them, you do kind of a forensic investigation, and they're like, well, I never intended my life to collapse. I was sincerely desiring some sort of success, but you go back and you look at the decisions that they made one after another, and you want to say to them, how did you not think your life would collapse? When you look at the choices that you made, this is going to be the end result. And so this is what Jesus wants to remind us today, that our direction determines the destination of our life. And so I invite you to turn to Matthew chapter 7. You can look on your mobile devices. We'll put the scripture up here. And Jesus, as we've been going these last few months through the Sermon on the Mount, Matthew 5, 6, and 7, a 22-minute kind of sermon collection, so to speak, of the sayings that Jesus had, but more than a collection. This is life in the kingdom. This is the way of the kingdom. Jesus talks about the heart of the kingdom, what it is to have a new heart, a heart for God. And now we move into kind of the third section of the Sermon on the Mount. This is the pathway of the kingdom. This is how you experience and move and live in the kingdom. And Jesus, he doesn't just teach for inspiration. He's not teaching us, oh, here's some really nice things to make you feel warm and fuzzy. He's teaching for application. He wants us to make a choice. And so as this sermon winds down over the next few weeks, we're going to look at 4 choices Jesus says we have to make. A choice of what way we're going to follow, the choice of who we're going to listen to, the choice of what kind of fruit is going to come from our life, and then lastly, the choice of which foundation we're going to build our life on. What are the truths that we're going to build life on? Now, before Jesus gets into that choice, there's this hinge verse that's kind of between what Jesus talks about God answering our prayer and listening to us and what he's going to say about a choice. And it's this verse in Matthew chapter 7, verse 12. He says, so whatever you wish that others would do to you, do also to them. For this is the law and the prophets. Whatever you wish others would do to you, then you do to them. And we know this as the golden rule. We've called it the golden rule. You grow up, you probably see it. Maybe it was on your classroom wall. It's one of those phrases that's part of really our culture. And it's an idea, the golden rule, that's not limited just to Christianity. In fact, in over 20 different religions, this rule appears, but it's very different. In fact, in Buddhism, it says this: hurt not others in ways that you yourself find hurtful. Don't do to someone else what would be hurtful to you. It's in the negative more. If something bothers you, hurts you, if that would be hard, then make sure you don't do that to someone else. Hinduism is very similar. It says, this is the sum of duty. Do not do to others what would cause pain if done to you. If something causes you pain, then make sure you don't do that to someone else. Avoid that. Now, 20 different religious writings, this kind of appears always as this, in more the negative. Jesus says it completely different. It's the only one who does. He says what? Do to others as you would have them do to you. And Jesus here is really saying, flip the blessing. Right? If God's blessing you, if God's done something for you, then you be sure to share that with others. Don't just avoid doing things that might hurt you. It's like, well, you should be thankful that I don't blast you away in rage because that would bother me. Jesus says, if God has blessed you, then bless them. And notice that this comes right after the passage that the Cerezas talked last week. And if you did not hear that message, I tell you, it's a message you need to hear once a week as you hear their testimony. But Jesus in that passage talks about the fact that God is a good father who doesn't give bad gifts. He gives good gifts to us. So we should bless others. Jesus said, if God gives you something good, then bless them. Like if your family member won the lottery, $70 or $80 million, what would you want them to do for you? Right? You'd want a piece of the pie. They've got more than enough. They got blessed. Why don't they bless me? We want a little part, as we would want that blessing. Jesus says the same. Bless others. And really is going to say, now show them the path. Show them the way. And I said, Jesus doesn't just preach for inspiration. He preaches for change. And now he's going to say, which path are you on? What pathway are you going to live your life? And in Matthew 7, verse 13, this is what he says. He says, enter by the narrow gate, for the gate is wide, and the way is easy that leads to destruction. And those who enter it are many, For the gate is narrow and the way is hard that leads to life, and those who find it are few. And Jesus says, what way are you on? And that's going to be just kind of the question we ask at the end of this morning. What path, what road, what way you are on? And to explain this, Jesus makes 4 comparisons. And the first, he talks about 2 gates, that there are 2 gates, not 3 gates, not 4 gates, not a whole bunch of gates. He says there's really 2 gates. 2 ways that you enter into a direction, a pathway in your life. He said the first is that there is a wide gate, that there is a big, broad gate where you get to enter life and you choose your own destiny. It's kind of choose your own adventure. You can follow me in any different way. You can go to God any different way. In the narrow gate, you choose. In the wide gate, you choose how you want to enter. But then Jesus says there is a narrow gate that leads to a narrow road that leads to life. Now, when Jesus says there's a narrow gate, he's talking about something very different. In John chapter 10, Jesus says, in fact, I am the gate. He's talking about himself. He says, I am the door. In John chapter 14, verse 6, Jesus says, I am the way, the truth, the life. No one comes to the Father. No one gets to God but through me. And Jesus says, I am the way. Because the broad way is a way that you get to God, or a philosophy that you have of your life or how you want to live, where you're in charge. You get to choose. You never quite know if you've made it or you're good enough for God. You just kind of choose your own adventure and hope at the end it will be okay. The broad way is the way of me. I'm going to choose how I live. The narrow way is the way of Jesus, but the way of Jesus is very different. Because Jesus doesn't say, here are a list of rules and regulations that you get to God. He says, I am the way. And he can say that because he gave his life on the cross. He died on the cross. He rose again. He conquered death. He, there on the cross, paid the way for our sins. He paid all of that. He says, you come to that way of life through me. It's because of what I've done. The broad way is what we do. Here's all the things I'm going to try to do to live a really good life. Jesus said, I've done it for you. And this is the power in life. The narrow way is that Jesus empowers, encourages, supports, gives us grace, peace, joy to live life. Now, Jesus here uses a word we don't like in our culture. We don't like the word narrow. Right? No one wants to be narrow-minded. No one wants to have a narrow view of life. We don't want to feel narrow. We don't want to be narrowed in to something. We want a broad, we want a big kind of life. And in particular, when it comes to items of faith or philosophy or things, we want a very broad way. But in reality, we like narrow ways. In fact, many things in our life are focused on narrow ways. Over our life, we've been privileged to have some Olympic athletes in our home. Have you ever had an Olympic athlete for dinner? Do you know what you feed them? No one knows what to feed them. But you listen to them talk, and they have a very narrow way of living and training. They have a coach who says, this is what you do. If you want success, this is what you do. And you as an Olympic athlete can't go to your coach and say, you know what, I'm going to live on Twinkies and chips, and I'm going to try for the Olympics, because the coach is going to say you're not going to make it, because our direction determines our destination. If you want to eat what you want as an Olympic athlete and do what you want, you are in a very different direction than winning an Olympic medal. If you have cancer and you go to your oncologist, you don't want a broad oncologist. You don't want an oncologist that says, oh, it really doesn't matter what kind of treatment. There's a whole array of treatments, and it would be very narrow-minded just to pick one treatment, like that would be exclusive to the others. We're going to just let you just pick and choose. You just pick and choose. You don't want a financial advisor who's playing broad with your money. Well, we could invest in a number of different things. I know that you sincerely want this nest egg to grow, so it doesn't really matter. We'll just invest it wherever. You want a very narrow financial investor who's going to do the best with your money. We do that in many, many areas of life, except when it comes to faith or philosophy of life. And Jesus said, he says the most remarkable thing. He says, I am the way. He says, enter through the narrow gate. Now, and the word here for narrow, it really speaks of like something very narrow. And you think of kind of like a turnstile. If you go into maybe a ball game or an arena or something and you have to go through a turnstile, like you can't carry a lot of baggage with you. This is the great thing. You have to leave a lot of baggage. And Jesus says, enter through the narrow gate, because Jesus came, to deal with our baggage, came to deal with our life, came to deal with our past and our junk. He says, hey, I can handle that. I died on the cross for that. You don't have to carry that anymore. You see, in the broad way, we carry all of our junk and stuff, and we're trying to offload. Often what happens on the broad way is that we're dealing with baggage management. How do we manage all the baggage and stuff from our past, all the shame in life and decisions and all the root causes of life? How do we deal with that in this life? How do we deal with it in a way that people don't see it and we can minimize it? Jesus says, hey, just leave it at the foot of the cross. Just leave it there. Of course, this narrow idea goes against everything in our culture. If you want a conversation stopper, like if you're in a conversation and you don't know how to end it, here's how you end it. Say, Jesus is the only way to God. That'll end just about every conversation. Because about 150 years ago, like all of a sudden, culture, society began to think differently and began to think it's unfair to kind of elevate some religions over another. And people began to think, oh, really what religion is, it's like, it's climbing a mountain. And I'm not trying to be funny or facetious, but people think it's like climbing a mountain. You can pick a way. We're all going to the same destination. You can pick a way. And there's no sense of truth or right or wrong. It's kind of in your heart. You feel that in your heart. Whatever seems to be the right way for you, that's the way. And you just choose that way. It's wrong to kind of elevate something over another, except when you really look at all the religions, what their destination is sometimes quite different. They're all not going to the same place. And people will say, well, Muhammad didn't seem exclusive, like Buddha doesn't seem exclusive. Like, how is it that Jesus can say, I'm the only way? And when Jesus said that, there are really only two responses. One is that it's true, that it's absolutely true that Jesus gave his life, died on the cross, so that you and I can have life, that he opened a way and he made a very specific way so we didn't have to figure out how do we get to God and are we good enough and are we just sincere enough or our intentions are good. That Jesus, when he died and rose again, he opened a way. His resurrection opened a way. Either that's true or Jesus is the worst human ever to say to people, I'm the only way, if that weren't true. And there's really no middle ground. right? There's not a middle ground. It's like, well, I kind of like Jesus. I don't like this. I kind of like some of the other thing. If he said that and it's not true, if it's not true that he's the only way, that's the worst imaginable to deceive people. Now, what would be really bad is if Jesus was narrow, saying he's the only way, and that it was exclusive, right? Only a few can go. That Jesus is narrow and exclusive would be bad. I was reading this article on shopping, and it's kind of a fascinating article about how the super rich shop. I don't know what that says about what comes across my social media feed, but I was reading about how the super rich shop, and it talked about how they get invited to all these exclusive things, and actually the super rich get invited there, and there's special previews of everything, and they buy everything up before the public can. And so the public really get access to it because the super rich are already there, because there's a narrow way to get that stuff, and it's very inclusive. Jesus, it's narrow, he's the way, but it's not exclusive. It's like anybody. No one's excluded. No matter where you come from, no matter your language, no matter your race, no matter your culture or custom, no matter what you've done, everyone is welcome. It's the way. Jesus says, come. It's the way. And Jesus says there is a narrow gate and a wide gate. And the wide gate, he says, leads to a wide way. It leads to a wide road. There are two roads that he talks about. There's a wide gate that leads to a wide road, or a narrow gate that leads to a narrow way, or to a narrow road or a narrow way. And we know kind of what a broad way is, that we can enter into that life any way that we want. And the broad way says, I'm in charge of my life. I'm going to choose what I want. There are no bumpers. There are no real restrictions or rules. If I don't like something, I can change it. I can change course when I need to. If I don't have enough power, I can change vehicles of how I'm going to get there. It's a wide road. It's kind of a choose your own adventure life. But we feel good because we're in charge. And for a while, we feel maybe even invincible, like I'm in charge. And Jesus says the narrow gate, though, leads to a narrow way, a narrow road. And in fact, again, he says that that road is hard. And the idea is that it's very narrow. It's narrow in such a way, it's like walking on a ledge, right? Moving, trying to stick back, trying to cling to what's there, and someone may be leading or guiding your hand. It's very narrow. But after a while, you find safety. There's a sense of peace, security. Jesus says the wide way, you got lots of choice. And he said, what? It's easy. It's the easy way. Now, easy we like in life. But easy doesn't often get us places. Right? Many times we don't want a hard conversation. We want easy conversations. But easy conversations don't usually solve things. If you go to the gym and work out, you don't really want the easy routine, except if you maybe want to not sweat and take a selfie of you in the gym. The easy routine, it doesn't build muscle. It doesn't do anything. The hard routine does. And Jesus said, you can choose the easy way, or you can choose the hard way. And he's already in the Sermon on the Mount talked about what the hard way is. And if you review over the last while what Jesus has said, like in the broad road, you can judge things. People will judge you. There's lots of judgment and condemnation. On the hard road, Jesus says, stop judging. Stop dismissing people. On the broad way, there's lots of decisions to make, and you never know how to make a decision, and you're just every man for himself, and you got to figure it out. On the narrow way, Jesus says, sometimes you just have to go into a room, shut the door, and listen to what God has to say. He'll guide you. On the broad way, you can feel your feelings, you can get angry, you can be enraged, you can hurt people the way that you want. On the narrow way, Jesus says, put love in your heart. Don't let anger rule you. On the broad way, there's all sorts of worries and concerns, and you filter through all those things in your mind, and you wonder what's going to happen, and there's sleepless nights and everything. On the narrow way, Jesus says, don't worry, because God's a good God, and he's going to walk with you. On the broad way, there's all sorts of ways to spend your money and use your resources, and you can do what you want, and you can waste it or whatever, and you can buy things that really have no lasting value. On the narrow way, Jesus says, why don't you make sure that you have some investments that have eternal value? And Jesus said, you can do whatever you want in the broad way. You can make your choices, but the narrow way, God's going to guide you. It'll eventually get you life. Now, Jesus here says there's two gates that lead to two roads, and on those roads, there are two crowds, two very different crowds. On the broad way, there's what? There's a big crowd. There are many. You kind of go with popular opinion. On the narrow way, there's not many people. On the Broadway, you do what people say. It's like easy, like you're on the Broadway, like everybody else is there. They're probably cheering you on. But we don't make choices, right, based on what is popular opinion. And popular opinion keeps changing. You never quite know. Some things are in and then they're out. And look at the last 4, 8, 15 years, right? Popular opinion has changed. How people felt then is very different how people feel now. On the broad road, you never quite know what popular opinion is going to be, but we don't make decisions on the crowd. Jesus said that the narrow way, there's few. People aren't going to cheer for you when you pick the narrow way. People aren't going to celebrate you. In fact, people may leave you or mock you on that narrow way. It's not what popular opinion has to say. And people on the broad way, there's big crowds, lots of excitement, lots of things that are happening, but all of a sudden, Jesus said, that leads to destruction. See, there are two very different destinations. When people enter through the gates, there's kind of the idea, the thinking, the hope that both of those ways it will lead to life. That both of those gates, there's good things at the end. But Jesus says that there's something about the broad way that leads, notice, to destruction. Now, Jesus here, you've got to talk to him. He doesn't say there's a broad way that leads to disappointment or discouragement. He says it's destruction. That the broad way promises life, but takes us to a very different destination. The narrow way, Jesus says, is how you get life. And I think when Jesus is talking about life, he's talking about how you experience kind of a fullness of life here. And again, when you hear the Serezes talking about, even in very challenging circumstances, how they found life. It's life here, but life eternal. Jesus says there's destruction on the broad road. And I think it's sense destruction here, right, of worry, anxiety, anger, judgment, confusion, trying to be seen and noticed. That destroys our soul. But then I think Jesus referred to eternal destruction. That if you're on the broad way and you just keep saying, hey, get away from me, God, get away from me, God, get away from me, God, God, get away. I don't want anything to do with you. Eventually, what happens? God gets away. God says, you're on your own. God says, there's no hope. Separation from God. No eternity with him. Destruction. Now, it's fascinating to me that when it kind of comes to this topic, that most of the debate and discussion is about the gates. Right? Is there a broad gate? Is there a narrow gate? Is it too narrow to say Jesus? Can you really say that? Shouldn't we say that everything's broad? People rarely debate the destination. It was like, oh, there must be, everything will be okay. It will all work out. Jesus doesn't say it'll all work out. He says there's life or there's destruction. And we don't like that because we don't like consequences in our culture, right? We're trying to live as a culture that minimizes consequences. If you do something wrong, even if you commit a small crime, there's no consequences. We live in a consequence-free culture. And I remember seeing this coming about 20, 25 years ago. My wife was teaching in a high school, and the high school had a zero hat policy. Right? You couldn't wear a ball cap inside the school. That just wasn't considered proper. And so this teen boy one day walked into school with his hat on. The vice principal took the hat and said, hey, I'll give it back to you at the end of the day. You know, we have a zero policy on hats. And instead of saying, okay, I'll come back and get the hat, what did the teen boy do? He called the police. The police came and made him give the hat back. Because we don't want consequences. We don't want consequences. And so we don't want there to be really a consequence for eternity. That can't be. There's no consequence with God. We want a broad path. Anything goes and be on the same destination. Jesus said, our decisions determine the direction, and the direction determines the destination. So let me just bring this home. Because Jesus says here, there are two crowds. Right? There's a large crowd and a small crowd. Now, my guess is on the Broadway with the large crowd, there's actually a lot of people on that way who are admirers of Jesus. Like, yeah, Jesus was good. I love what he had to say. He had some really good things to say. That he's the only way, like, I don't know about that. And if he said he's not the only way and destruction is the end, he's even more heinous as a person. I think there are a lot of people who are admirers of Jesus, but they're not followers. They're fans of Jesus, but not followers of Jesus. And I know lots of people in my life as I've got to interact, as I get to interact with high points and low points of people. Many people who at one day were on the broad path and realized where it was leading and said, hey, I want to leave that and follow Jesus. And who found a different sense of meaning and hope and security. So let me talk to just three groups of people. First group is maybe you're here and you've never really thought, is there a path? What it is, you're just kind of going down life. And what Jesus says here is getting you to think. And maybe you're thinking, yeah, I've been thinking the broad path. I've been trying different things. Maybe I'm exploring religion or philosophy or places of thought. I've never thought that there were two paths, but Jesus, He invites us to something different. This is a religion of trying to do things. Jesus invites us to a relationship. He says, hey, you can't come in with all your baggage. You can't come in with a crowd. It's just you and me. And maybe today's the day you say, hey, I want to follow Jesus. I want to give my life to him. I want to start on that path. And if that's you today, we have a special gift at the end of the service we'd love to be able to give you to help you on that journey. And maybe today's the day that you just say yes to Jesus. I want to say yes to him. Now, there's a second group of people, and maybe it's though you're like on that broad path. You're like, hey, yeah, I'm on that path. I love trying to explore things. I've got different things. I like some of the things that Jesus says. I might be Jesus adjacent. I'm kind of near him. But maybe Jesus is saying to you today, it's time to stop being an admirer, right? Because we can be admirers. We admire Mother Teresa, like everybody admires Mother Teresa and her help with the poor. Most people don't leave their job and follow the poor and be followers of Mother Teresa. And the same with Jesus. That you admire Jesus, but you know you're on the broad path. You're just doing your own thing. Maybe today's the day to say, hey, I want to follow Jesus. I'm going to go through that narrow gate. Maybe there's a third group of you. And maybe you entered the narrow gate and you were on that narrow path and then maybe got tired, or there was a crowd that brought you kind of to the broad way and you kind of like just gave up on Jesus. Maybe you didn't even give up on him. Maybe you just got so distracted. And then you wake up this morning and you realize, I'm not close to him. I'm kind of far away in the broad path. Maybe today's the day. Maybe today's the day to leave the broad way and start walking again on the narrow path. Let's pray together. And if you're here and you've never given your life to Jesus today, maybe that day to say yes to him. To say, hey, Jesus, I've been walking this broad way, trying to figure life out, maybe doing it on my own, hoping I'm good enough, hoping I can make the right decisions, but I feel very alone. Sure, there's a crowd around me, but I feel inwardly alone. And I know, Jesus, that you came 2,000 years ago to show us the Father who God is, and that you came to open the way to God, that your death and resurrection conquered sin and death, made it possible to deal with my shame and my guilt and my baggage. Come into my life. And Lord, take charge of my life. Or maybe you want to say, hey, Jesus, I've been an admirer, a fan. I've loved what you've said. I enjoy being around Christian people, but I really haven't made a choice to follow you. Maybe I'm only here because it's family, maybe it's friend, people, maybe it's just culture or I'm accustomed. But Lord, I want to move from being an admirer to a follower. So Jesus, come into my life. Take charge of my life. Help me to follow you. Help me to be on the path of life. Or maybe you want to pray, Jesus, I've followed you. I made a decision. I entered that narrow gate, but through a series of circumstances I can't even explain, I feel like I'm on the broad road, and today's the day that I want to go back and I want to recommit my life to you and follow you. And if you've made that decision today, at the end of our service, our prayer partners are going to be here and we want to give a gift to you. But Jesus, he made the way. This is what we celebrate in communion. And in a moment, we're going to just take communion. We're going to share in the bread and the wine. It's a reminder of what Jesus did to make a way for us. So I invite us to stand, and the ushers are going to come if you didn't get the bread and the communion elements, and they'll give them to you. But let's sing about Jesus who made a way for us.